Hey listeners, my name is Kay and this is Dark Tales from the Road. Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning in today for episode 31. I'm so excited to be back in the swing of things. Happy New Year! I hope all of you had an amazing last couple months. I know times have been so hard for everybody, so I'm always thinking about all of you guys, and hope you're doing well. So today I'm just gonna jump right into it. I'm excited about these new episodes. So today we're going to be going to Rhode Island. I've never been there before, and we're going to explore the Ladd School, Ladd, in Exeter, Rhode Island. So if you're new here, I do like to start with history. I love history about places, and I'm learning so much doing this research. So I'm going to talk about a little history of Rhode Island, then I'm going to talk about a little bit of history in Exeter, and then we're going to jump into the history of the school and a lot of the paranormal and the hauntings that are going on there. So I knew nothing about Rhode Island. I grew up in Colorado. The furthest east is I've gone, I've been to DC, but I lived in South Carolina, so I just haven't been ever exposed to that area, the New England area. So this was really cool for me to discover this state, and it has a very, very long history, so I did cut it short at some point, but I found some really crazy details. So let's jump right in. So Rhode Island, it is actually only 48 miles long and 37 miles wide. That is tiny. The drive from Fort Collins to Denver in Colorado is longer than that. It's insane. And so it is one of the smallest of the states, and very small. It's known as the Ocean State because over 400 miles of Rhode Island is coastline. And it is the most densely populated and heavily industrialized for the size of the state. It's pretty crazy, and it is tiny. So this man named Roger Williams, he comes from the Massachusetts Bay Colony because he was kicked out. He had extremely radical views, and Massachusetts was not having it. So he came to the area of Rhode Island. He purchased some land from the Indians there. I forgot to look up how to say this, but I'm going to try the Narragansett, maybe? And so working with the Native Americans there, he founded the very first permanent white settlement in Providence in 1636. So a lot of the radical views that they're talking about is he believed in religious freedom and in tolerance and the separation of church and state with the governing of the colony of Rhode Island. And his views actually inspired a lot of the founders of the United States as time went on. So he was a big deal in history, but I have never heard of this man. So it's just really cool to discover things like that. So the state was named by a Dutch explorer. His name was Adrian Block, and he named it, I looked it up to say it correctly, Rutenland. Yes. In English it looks like rooted island, because there's an E. It's very weird. But I did look up the pronunciation. In Dutch, it's Rutenland. Rutenland, yes. And it means red island because the shores of Rhode Island are, red clay. So Adrian named it that, and then later it became anglicized when British rule came over that region, and then they, made it Rhode Island. So during the colonial period of Rhode Island, the city of Newport was a huge place for shipping and trade. And then into the 19th century, Rhode Island was at the front of the Industrial Revolution, and established a ton of textile mills. Rhode Island's name was actually called the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. That was the state. That was the name of the state, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. That's a very, very long name. It's actually the longest of any state in America. And it was officially named that from 1663 when it was founded until 2020. And Rhode Islanders were pissed. They wanted the Providence and Plantations part of the state name gone, because plantations have such a bad connotation to that word. And I'll address that in a little bit, because I talk about kind of the slave trade that happened in the North. And so in 2020, that's when the name was officially shortened to Rhode Island. How insane is that, you guys? So Benedict Arnold, I know we've heard that name before in other episodes. He was the first governor under Rhode Island, and it was still a part of a royal charter. But he was the first governor in 1663. So we've all heard the name Benedict Arnold before, from the notorious traitor who was on the American side and then went to the British side and gave away tactics and secrets and all kinds of stuff. So, horrible man. But this Benedict Arnold is the great grandfather of the Benedict Arnold in the Revolutionary War. So, a lot of generations of Benedict Arnolds. And then over like the next few decades, just Rhode Island was overwhelmed with thousands of settlers that came in. So in 1675, things were getting almost violent because they needed more land for, this growing population. And it actually led to a war. It was called King Philip's War. But King Philip's, I think, is very misleading to a lot of us because we think of British rule and King Philip, but at the time they were actually under the rule of King George. So this was actually fought between the Wampanoag. Yeah, the Wampanoag. Sorry, I really want to make sure I get these names right. I've said them so wrong in the past before. The Wampanoag. So the Native American tribe, and its leader, his name was Metacomet, and he was also known as Philip. So that's why it was the King Philip's War, and it lasted only 14 months. But Rhode Island was completely changed by this war because so many indigenous people were killed. And if they weren't killed, they attempted to flee, and if they were captured, they were sold into slavery. In the 1700s, Rhode Island had a huge impact on the transatlantic trade, including slaves from Africa. So I want to take like a tangent here and talk about the slavery in the North at the time, ranging from the 1840s, 1850s, and then into the 1700s, and pretty much all the way into the 1900s. So it's not a ton, but I do want to address it because I found it very interesting. I guess I always had this thought that slaves were free in the North and, enslaved in the South and all that with the Revolutionary War. But this was very eye-opening for me, so I wanted to share it. So we all know that the South was very much dominated with slavery and it being legal. But before the Civil War happened, in the North, especially like the New England states, which consists of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, they all have a very crazy history of slavery. So, like I said earlier, when the Europeans started coming over and taking these lands, they actually would enslave the Native Americans who lived there, or they would continually push the Native American nations out of their homes and, take over their land. And they pushed them out to where the enslaved Native American people were gone, and the enslaved Africans came in to replace them, and the area became very heavy in the slave trade to help power their economies. So again, like I talked about in 2020 when they changed the name, Rhode Island had addressed its history of slavery, and the governor at the time, Governor Gina Raimundo, she had announced the state's official name would no longer appear in state documents, and the state would just be identified as Rhode Island instead of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. So I read this amazing article about slavery in the North, and so I will quote some different people because their quotes are very good, and I think it's a great explanation of kind of what was going on at this time that I personally had no idea. I'm going to read this quote by she's a professor of history and Afro-American studies in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she's also the author of a book called Dark World, The Business of Slavery in Rhode Island. So she says, quote, most of the general public in the U.S. has no understanding of the very long history of slavery in the northern colonies and the northern states. She continues to say they don't have a sense that slavery was integral to the building of New York City and places like Newport and Providence, that many of these cities had upward of 20% of their populations enslaved, and that slavery lasted in the North well into the 1840s. Some states like New Jersey never abolished slavery, so slavery legally ended there in 1865. So going back to, we talked about Roger Williams. He was the, founder of Rhode Island. He was the one who put this name into place, but when he used the word plantation, he was referring to a new settlement. Plantation didn't actually get its description and connotation until much later into the 19th century, because the word plantation became synonymous with the enslaved Black people on large farms. So it changed the meaning of the word. And so, today, this is the meaning that we talk about. You hear of a plantation and you think of a large farm with enslaved Blacks, And, there were huge activists that called for the word plantation to be taken out of its name. I am shocked that it wasn't until 2020. Just like, I understand that the word at the time didn't mean what it is known now, but still, Even in the 17th century, the word plantation just was described as European colonization. But that colonization was violent, and slavery was just entwined in that. So I have a quote also from a woman named Margaret Ellen Newell. She's a history professor at Ohio State, and she wrote a book called Brethren by Nature, New England's Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery. She says, slavery was a global market. It was a global phenomenon, and it was tied to colonization. Going back to the 17th century, most of the slaves in the area were Native Americans. But in the 18th century, colonists were able to gain access to markets around the world. We're traveling in ship, everything. And that gave them access to the slave market. And so these colonists were extremely violent. They wanted the natives off of this land so they could take over. and then brought in, enslaved Africans to work on their farms. And they had more smaller farms, but there were large plantation style ones. And so they would also work in homes. There were shipyards and there were mines all in that area. So the colonists in the New England area were very invested in the slave trade. They actually bought shares in slave ships, and that also helped boom their economy because they were getting profits from human trafficking of these people. So there were actually early statutes that were put in place in the New England area, but they were all local to their state or whatever, and they were weak. They were not enforced, yeah. And that started in 1652 in the cities of like Providence and Warwick. So these statutes were limiting the enslavement of Africans and Native people. So they likely passed these statutes to differentiate themselves from Massachusetts Bay Colony, as it was called at the time, because they legalized slavery in 1641. And so people had come to Providence and Warwick to get away from that. But like I said, they didn't enforce any of this. And so in 1703, the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations, so they came in with new laws, arranging them very specifically in the system that they're creating of the enslaved Africans and Native Americans. So by 1750, Rhode Island had the highest percentage of enslaved people in all of New England. It was a huge player in the global slave trade. Like, reading all this just blew my mind. I had no idea. So sadly, like, the North was the backbone of the expansion of slavery that ended up in the South. So like I said, New England had just huge textile mills and were thriving over these. And those textiles were made with cotton that was picked by enslaved people in the South. And those people never received any compensation for their work. Because a lot of times, they got somewhere to sleep, something to eat, but they were never paid for their work. Rhode Island also excelled in the rum trade. And that was huge because with the rum came trafficking humans in Africa and the Caribbean and just upping the slave trade even more. Even in New England, these people were not getting compensated for their work. There was a ton of different free labor that was going on, and the North slavery was just as bad as the South. And there were not as many large farms in the North as there was the South. So they did have fewer enslaved people, but still, like, they were still enslaved. They were still not getting compensated for their work. Just an overall terrible, terrible situation. So another quote from, I don't know if I said her name at the top, Christy Clark Pujara. She was the professor of studies in Afro-American studies. I don't think I actually said her name, but I do have another quote from her. She said, quote, "There is a strong fiction that slavery was mild in the North. There is absolutely no historical evidence to support that. Bondage was bondage. People were beaten and tortured in the North just like they were beaten and tortured in the South, and it was just bad in different ways." New England had a hard time sustaining the large plantation farms. Unlike the South, that was a huge part of that. A lot of the slaveholders in the North, they only had like one or two enslaved people. And Clark Pujara says again, quote, "The very few historical documents that we have left of enslaved people tell us about the horror of the loneliness of slavery in the North, the horror of having to live in the same dwelling and sleep in the doorway of a person who robbed you of your liberty every hour of every day. So in the 18th century, some northern states passed bans on slavery, but many, white people continued to keep their black slaves illegally in their home. And, it says that Rhode Island banned slavery in 1843, but it still continued until just before the Civil War. But other states like New Hampshire and New Jersey never banned slavery. Slavery only became illegal with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. So that's a little history about the slave trade. It just baffled me that I had no clue. Like, I think we all just get this generalization that the North, they're free, and the South, they're not. But wow, that just hit me. Little more facts about Rhode Island. So eventually, on May 4th of 1776, Rhode Island became the first colony to renounce allegiance to King George III of England. Then in 1908, the General Assembly of Rhode Island, they made May 4th, quote, Rhode Island Independence Day. To me, it is May the 4th be with you. But, I'm just kidding, guys. It's pretty cool that they have their own little Independence Day. So some fun facts here. JFK and Jacqueline Bouvier, they were actually married in Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island. It's the oldest Roman Catholic parish that was established in 1828. Rhode Island is the only state that celebrates the end of World War II on Victory Day. They call it VJ Day, and it's an official state holiday that's observed each year in the second Monday of August. Rhode Island actually refused to participate in the creation of the U.S. Constitution and was the last of the original 13 states to ratify it. And lastly here, Rhode Island is known for its mansions. Just huge ones, especially a part of Newport that overlook the ocean. And these houses are actually open for tourists. And so you can get a glimpse inside, the lives of Americans' high society. There's a mansion called the Breakers, and it was actually the Vanderbilt mansion that was built in 1895. And it is to be the most elegant private home that, in Newport. So that's kind of cool. So now we're going to jump into the city. Sorry the state kind of took so long, but I really wanted to cover that huge tangent. So we're going to Exeter. Exeter was actually inhabited long before the colonists arrived. Native Americans had lived there on that land for thousands of years. The name Exeter comes from the town and city of Exeter in Devon, England. There's actually a lot of Exeters out there because of British rule, So it's in Washington County, very small town, very quiet, very small. And they say it's also very charming and serene. But when you learn its history, it doesn't seem as charming and serene. It has a very long past, and this is how they described it in this article. They said, Exeter has a past that seems straight out of a horror film, except it's all completely true. Very scary. And we'll get to that because it's crazy. So, again, Roger Williams, he formed the state of Rhode Island. He befriended the Native American tribes, and he had huge respect for these people. He knew that they were powerful. He knew they'd been there a long time. It was a good partnership. But as soon as, again, the colonists started to come in, that respect was completely gone, and they just took over their land and pushed them out or enslaved them. And so in 1643, Roger Williams, he made his permanent home in an area that is present-day North Kingston near Exeter. So Roger Williams was a huge part of it still. In 1651, he wanted to go back to England to really secure Rhode Island as a colony. and get its charter. And so at that time, he sold his land to a man named Richard Smith. In the 1800s, Exeter just thrived. Farmers and villages just started growing everywhere, along the rivers and streams. Textile manufacturing came in, sawmills and different stores, taverns, schools, a library, churches, and a bank were all established there. It was founded officially in 1742, so it has a ton of history, but it's not all great history. In the 19th century, tuberculosis just ran rampant in Rhode Island, and it claimed the life of a young girl named Mercy Brown, age 19, and this was in 1892. So a lot of you podcast listeners, and if you like the spooky stuff, you may have heard of Mercy Brown. So this is kind of the story about Mercy Brown and this panic that was created over it after the tuberculosis outbreak. So more and more and more people are dying from TB, and by the time Mercy had passed away, that family had already lost Mercy's mother and her sister to TB. There were just so many deaths. It was running rampant that people were actually starting to get very suspicious about what was going on. They didn't know what TB was, and they actually started to blame something a lot darker. They actually blamed it on vampires. They thought that if more than one family member died from TB or this, unknown disease to them, it meant that someone in their family was a vampire. Then with all that, there became a panic. It was known as the New England Vampire Panic. It was such a dark time for their history because it was so similar to the Salem witch trials. There was a very disturbing thing that took place at the graveyard next to Chestnut Hill Baptist Church. So this was where Mercy Brown was buried, and Mercy's brother actually became sick with TB, and the father he couldn't lose another member of the family. So he actually decided to exhume Mercy's body along with the mother and the sisters. While looking at the mothers and sisters, they showed immense decay, but Mercy's body was well preserved, and it threw the locals into a tizzy. The craziest part of this is that there was still blood in her heart and signs that she had moved in her grave. With all that, Mercy was accused of being the vampire in the family. So they took her heart and liver and burned them. The ashes were then mixed with water to create a tonic that was given to her sick brother to drink. So this boy was tortured, making him drink all this, and it was all for nothing because he died of TB 2 months later. With all that, there are reports of paranormal activity at the Chestnut Hill Cemetery where Mercy was buried and her whole family, and a ton of other TB victims were buried there. That's a little history of Exeter. I know I could have gone into a little more detail, but I'm ready to jump into the Ladd School, a crazy history. I'm so excited about this one, even though it is completely horrible what happened there. The Ladd School was originally an asylum for children with disabilities. Through its time, it kept transforming into different things and more complicated things, and it became hard to define what the Ladd School was, because it was kind of like a hospital or a detention center, a boarding school, but the residents there, they were called inmates, and they were called Feeble Minded. And so that was considered a legal medical diagnosis, that it was very open to interpretation. It could be so many different things. But now it's referred to the word, quote, mental retardation or developmental disabilities, like what that's feeble-minded would be called today. So many people were admitted here because of developmental or intellectual disabilities, and others were physically disabled, they were mentally ill, they were elderly, sick, homeless, or just this what they said considered a detriment to society. And with that, a lot of them were immigrants. They were criminals and orphans, and even unwed mothers were sent there, to the point where people who were being sent there had no disability at all. It's just sick. Rhode Island School for the Feeble Minded, that's what it was called when it opened in 1908, and it was called that until 1916. That school was really just a remote area where children and young adults with disabilities, they were sent to live there, but they were also sent to work. So they wanted to help educate them so that they can return to society and contribute. They would learn to farm and live. And at the time, it was just a boys' school, but then female, quote, inmates, I can't believe they called everybody inmates, they came in 1913. So in 1917, the school was renamed the Exeter School. So Dr. Joseph Ladd, he was the first superintendent there, and he was a physician and, classically educated. He was a very strict teacher. He was a huge part of the institution in its earlier days, and he was, this very noteworthy contributor to public welfare in the state. But as years went on, he started to develop a reputation for mistreatment of the students. In 1916, he changed the name to Exeter School in order to combat the public's disapproval of the word feeble-minded. By the 1920s, the institution, its purpose had become something different altogether. And a lot of that had to do with eugenics that started to really ramp up in America. Eugenics had a lot to do with criminality and hereditary items that were causing problems in society. And so a lot of these men and women were committed to this institution because of eugenics. Again, this area was to help train people with disabilities in farm work and mechanical stuff to put them back in society. But one of the institution's first forefathers, I guess, his name was Dr. Walter Fernald. Sorry. He was actually a very famous eugenicist, and he strived to remove feeble-minded people from society to cleanse the population of defective genes. And that is actually what the school became defined as, and its purpose. Very sad. So with eugenics going on at the time, a lot of states had passed sterilization laws. So I have a quote here from Dr. Ladd himself that he from an article in the Providence Journal that was published in 1948. It says, quote, many states have already passed sterilization laws for eugenic purposes, and I hope Rhode Island won't stay behind much longer. Unless something is done to stop the propagation of the mentally deficient, we cannot expect the coming generations to be predominantly virile and sound in mind and body. In that case, a general deterioration of intelligence and predispositions of inferior stock is inevitable, especially since the trend all along has been for smaller families in the higher grades of the population. Modern society circumvents nature's law of the survival of the fittest. We mustn't go too far in allowing not only the survival, but also the manipulation of the unfit. The school was criticized heavily during this time because so many people were getting sent to this institution. It was starting to overcrowd, and these people were not getting the care that they needed. It literally was described as a quote-unquote dumping ground. They started making zero effort towards these people to get them out of the institution and back in society. Something that was revealed was that they would say that you would get a physical exam when you were admitted to the institution, but no psychological exam was given. They just received this very generic diagnosis, I guess, and they were thrown in there and cleaned and fed. But that was about it. There was no treatment. So continued overpopulation showed that there was one doctor working at the Ladd School, and that was Dr. Joseph Ladd. One doctor. And the other staff, they were just there. They literally had like no medical training. They didn't know what they were doing. So in the 20th century, Exeter School didn't educate or train its population. It just continued overcrowding. And so the entire building was used as living quarters for, this population, which included young children and girls, and everything was filled to capacity. They were not adopting the same ideals of other institutions because it just literally focused on detaining these people and getting rid of them and segregating them from society. And even like people with petty crimes or no crimes at all, and especially women accused of prostitution, sodomy, extramarital intercourse, and illegitimate pregnancies. It was really pushed on them to be separate and gone. Even the courts were involved, but the courts gave Exeter School leverage when it came to getting rid of cases that affected bloodline of families. That really ramped up sterilization. But it was illegal in Rhode Island. And so a lot of the women were sent there and confined until menopause or death. And a few were sterilized by willing surgeons who would do it, but do it around the law. Until the end of World War II, Exeter School, its only function at the time was eugenics, segregation, sterilization, and death, a lot of death for these people. So during Prohibition, the Depression that came, women were continually being committed to Exeter School. A lot of it was because they were arrested for prostitution. They had illegitimate pregnancies, they committed adultery, and a lot of other sexually related things that they were doing. Decades of severe overcrowding, no money coming in, and the living conditions started to plummet. The administration of the Exeter School started to shift. They were starting to take a stand against the government. So in 1947, Dr. Ladd discharged 1/3 of the Exeter School's population. So that was more than 900 people. And it was a decision made because the institution was financially struggling. Doing that, it did help them recover financially and getting more money from the state. But, the school's role was to help these people get back into society, but it was impossible to achieve this. Like, they just were never able to get to that point where they were able to take these, immoral and criminal people, delinquents, and change them to be put back into society. So they continued to expand the institution with this new money that they were getting, and they did more buildings, and, with that came more population and, institutionalizing people with extremely severe disabilities. But the living conditions were awful. They never got better. More and more of the population was starting to become younger. More and more had severe disabilities. And so that gave to a huge shortage of caregivers. And so, like I said earlier, they were not adequate for the job. They had no idea what was going on. Just insane. Some of the conditions were that the patients, they slept on cots and they were packed into a room, just head to foot, rows of cots with just inches between them. And they were routinely beaten, and a lot of the rooms had no toilets or sinks. There was massive rat infestation in the living and dining areas, and their medical conditions were not being addressed. It's said that one female inmate turned up pregnant twice, either by other mentally handicapped inmates or by the hospital staff. There's a story of a boy, he was only 9 at the time. He was found stuffed in a laundry sack and left in a shower stall where he asphyxiated. And another was an elderly man who was killed when another patient pushed him down a flight of stairs. Also, patients were being overdosed. Their medication was not handled properly, not prescribed properly, and given to them by a person with no medical training. So it's they were just being poisoned left and right. Skin diseases and boils were just running rampant in there, and a lot of them were just showing massive signs of neglect. They were literally just laying around waiting for death. So when people were discharged or released, they would go to their normal doctors and they were outraged because they were shown no dignity, no care, nothing in this so-called school. An inspector actually came in and he said he found bloody sponges and towels in the dentistry room floor and could find no means of sterilization except for a bar of soap that he picked up from under a chair. That was it. So with all the overcrowding, lack of staff, lack of training, supervision became extremely difficult. That created more chaos, more violence, more crimes, because they were getting away with it better. So in 1955, there was a situation that really hit the school hard. There was a 20-year-old inmate. He was, sentenced to be a ward of the state for life. They committed him because they named him a defective delinquent, and he was implicated in the murder of a severely disabled child. That scandal really put an end to an era of the Exeter School, and Dr. Ladd resigned. He was there almost a half a century. They say that his resignation speech during it was very bittersweet, and he had just this very small glimmer of sentimentality in it. Not enough, but just small, So in 1958, it was changed, the name changed again to Dr. Joseph H. Ladd School, and this lasted until 1977. A lot of changes were coming in state laws and state regulations. So they reopened its first, dormitories for people with profound developmental disabilities. That was in 1953. So then they started construction of a modern school building and a hospital that was, state of the art. And that was in 1958 and 1962. And so the school began to really come to life as a developed institution. So Dr. Ladd, he resigned, and so the next doctor come in was Dr. John Smith. In 1956, he was a former director at the Connecticut Training School for the Feeble Minded. That's when the school name was changed from Exeter School to the Joseph Ladd School. Things were really renewed at this institution, and growth was coming. And so they started to bring about modern school buildings, again, hospitals, and they had single-story cottages. That is similar to now what we refer to as a group home. So, it was growing. It was getting better. Even, Dr. Smith And during his time there in the 60s and 70s, there were still troubles brewing. So advocacy groups really started at this time, and the employees started picketing for higher wages and better working conditions. And with that, people were trying to get Dr. Smith out because they were realizing he was mismanaging funds and he was abusing his power in the institution. So in 1978 to 1994, again, it's still called the Joseph Ladd Center, and population was peaking at over 8,000 residents. Then in 1970, the population started to come down. And this was this huge era of social advocacy and skilled caregivers really coming into place. So it was still federally funded, and they were excited about these advancements in like psychology and different sciences. Then it started to hold itself to a higher standard, more than any other time in their history. But in 1977, there was a scandal when the state appointed an investigation into the conditions at the Ladd School hospital building. There were reports of health violations at the dental clinic. So this report was leaked to the newspapers, and investigative journalists just went nuts. And they started to uncover tons of reports of health and human right violations, including deaths of patients due to negligence and malpractice. Legal teams started to step in and would prove that Smith and the institution and its entirety of its past was terrible. And so in 1978, the governor at the time fired Dr. Smith from the institution. The Ladd School actually continued on into the 1980s when, things were going okay. So they're still dealing with the 1977 scandal, and it ended with the institution having to revise its policies, its practice, and to reduce its population. So with that, the new director, his name was George Gunther, he came in, and the institution's population was going low. They were trying to reform the whole school, really put out there about community care and really helping these disabled people. This wasn't helping. It just became worse and worse until the governor at the time announced the closing of the Ladd School. And that was in 1986. But then not until 1993 was when the last few residents were relocated to other care facilities, and it was closed for good. So by the 20th century, completely abandoned. It just fallen to the elements, completely ruined. And, it closed in disgrace. And it tried to become many things after it closed. It was a homeless shelter, a movie set, a ghost town, and it's this local legend. And it became a destination for photographers, paranormal investigators, and, people came in and criminalized it. So in 2014, all of the buildings were demolished. And, today there's just crumbles of it that remain. So it doesn't even look like it existed at all. I think there are a couple buildings still there, now that I think about that. There's a movie called Exeter, and this was in 2015, and I guess it was released in the UK under the name The Asylum. It was filmed on location at the abandoned school before the buildings were demolished, and that was in 2013. It just came out in 2015, and it is they're trying to renovate the property and talking about a lot of the Ladd School's history that had happened there. I didn't watch it. I should have, but I didn't even think about it. Maybe I'll still watch it. Similar to kind of what happened in 2020 with everything that happened, it kind of goes back to some history in the 1900s when the Spanish flu came in to Exeter. And it was, dragged on for months, and it killed over 5,000 people in just the city of Providence. And it's very similar to kind of what happened, because it was hard to tell the death rate because of, other stuff that were going on at the time. And, medical science was not as advanced as it is today. They started shutting down businesses, banning public gatherings. The death toll went up, but things started to go down. More things reopened. Then they were letting kids back to school. After that, another epidemic happened where influenza started to climb and death started to climb. And that was in early 1919 when another wintertime flu took hold. And so for the Exeter School, which is now the Ladd School, I have a quote here that says, it's from Dr. Ladd, quote, "At the present time, we have no facilities whatever for the isolation of cases of contagious diseases. We have been fortunate in having had no epidemic up to the present time, but this fortune surely cannot continue indefinitely." He wrote this to the Rhode Island State Penal and Charitable Commission, being persistent about what is happening. And 9 months later, nearly all of the residents in his institution were infected with the flu, about 350 residents. And it wouldn't be the first or the last time that this would happen. There were, TB ran rampant, hepatitis, diseases, and, massive deaths. And it would be 17 years before they built the hospital. Spanish flu also struck the Ladd School because this was supposedly what happened is a child received a letter from their family's home that was infected with Spanish flu. So it spread quickly all over the buildings, just one into the other, and hundreds were ill, and a lot of the attendants, the staff there also, and this fever would last for weeks. So multiple volunteers came in from nursing schools, and even Dr. Ladd tended to the inmates during the day, and then it would help at laundry at night. And he said, quote, "I went 3 days without sleep. I had a temperature of 102 myself. I was the only doctor there." The Ladd School is known for paranormal things that go bump in the night and really question you, if that makes any sense. In that area, the Ladd School is very well known. Had this great start, is going to be a huge part of the community, and then it became a nightmare for these people, and it literally was the end of these people's lives. And it is believed that all of those people were unable to rest, and they are stuck in this school because of how they died and what they went through. So some of the ghosts that are there, there were so many patients there that there were so many bad things that happened inside that school. It's hard to determine how many entities are there. Restless souls that just wander the hallway. But it is certain by everybody that they have not left, and they are not going to leave. There are buildings that are more haunted than the other. Though they are torn down, this is coming from investigators that went through before it was torn down. So Therapeutic Pool building has very strange things going on it. You can hear a lot of shuffling of footsteps, but no source is found. There are cold spots that are felt throughout the building, and voices just being heard everywhere. And that structure is known as the Howe building, HOWE. A lot of whispers, a lot of voices in that area. There's also doors that have a locking mechanism, but none are locked. They hear strange noises. Animalistic growling is a huge one that is experienced by so many different people, and those are felt in the patient's rooms. But, when they go in with their equipment or whatever, there's nothing in that room. There is absolutely nothing. And the Fogarty buildings, it is said to really get into people's imaginations. So It's a cylindrical structure that you can hear phantom footsteps. But they're saying that a lot of it is not because of an inmate. And you can tell because you can hear the clicking of heels and going like in a fast pace, believing that it's one of the hospital administrators. Also, voices are heard throughout the other buildings, and a lot of them can be of children. Very creepy. Ugh. A lot of the locals know that this abandoned school is haunted. They've also reported hearing moaning, footsteps, shuffling, and crying throughout the buildings. They hear disembodied voices, murmuring, wisping, or crying out. They've seen doors that open and close without explanation, and then those same doors seem to lock, and there's no lock on the door. So there's literally no reason why you couldn't open the door. They, like I said, they hear growling sounds in patients' rooms. There's no animals around there. People have claimed to be touched, shoved, and they've had items knocked out of their hands by some force. And when you're outside the facility, it's said that visitors have claimed to see human-shaped shadows moving across the field and into the woods. Voices have been heard out there, as well as a ton of photographs that have been taken showing glowing orbs. Car radios go crazy and they can just stop working. And they have also claimed their car alarms or their horns go off for no reason. All in all, the lad school was a nightmare for these patients. It is no wonder that they are still there after death. They are restless souls, and they'll probably remain there, just wandering the halls alone and crying out for that help that never came to them. It's so sad. So yeah, that is the lad school. There were a lot of people that stood, like on YouTube, I found a ton of videos about them explaining the history and, like I said, about the different voices and feelings and happenings that going on there. And now that it's demolished, it's a bummer, you know. But I just think asylums are crazy. And I always joke with my husband that if I lived in that era, I would totally be put in asylum for being crazy, or I'd be burned at the stake because they thought I was a witch or something, just, you know. But they fascinate me, and so I really wanted to include the lad school because I had never heard of it, and especially because it lasted until the 90s. Like, that's just crazy. But also in the show notes, which are at the bottom of the description, I put a YouTube video on there. It is about the lad school, and it shows a ton of pictures from the lad school. Explains a lot of what I said about the neglect and the history and all of that. So if you'd like to really see the visualization of the lad school, definitely check out the YouTube video. It is the first link there. But yeah, so that is the lad school for today. Thank you all for joining me on coming up the 13th, we have a bonus Dark Tale, and then on the 18th, we are going to Hawaii. I'm also doing a new series for the zodiac signs. I have always been interested in astrology, so I want to learn more, and so I thought, hey, maybe I should show everybody the zodiac sign that we're in for the month, and I'm going to be doing it on the 23rd of every month. So usually that falls into the beginning of a new sign. So we're actually going to be in Aquarius on January 23rd, and so in December is when I'll come around back to the Capricorns. I apologize, Capricorns, but I wanted to give myself, I just thought of this, so I wanted to give myself the space to research and get ready for it. So yeah, we will have, again, a bonus on the 13th. We'll be in Hawaii on the 18th, and we'll be going through Aquarius on the 23rd, and then to finish out January, we are going to be in Pennsylvania. Super, super excited. So thank you all for listening. I appreciate everything that you guys do. I'm so excited to be back in the swing of things. And you can follow me on Instagram at Dark Tales from the Road. I have a Twitter, Dark Tales FTR. I have a TikTok, Dark Tales from the Road. And I have a Facebook group, Dark Tales from the Road Podcast. I think that's it. But yeah. Oh, and I have a YouTube where I post these episodes. If you'd rather listen to them on YouTube, great. I don't care. Whatever you guys are comfortable with is awesome to me. Thank you guys for listening and for your support, and we will see you on Friday the 13th for our next bonus episode. See you then, guys. Bye.